Here we are again with another screencast with Chapter 4 and talking about cell transport. Remember, cell transport is dealing with molecules and substances that we're moving either into a cell or out of a cell, across cell membranes. So in the last screencast we talked about osmosis as being a specific type of diffusion. Remember that it's a type of passive transport. That means that there's no energy. There's my abbreviation for energy. Saves me a couple letters. But there's no energy being used. The cell doesn't need any of that nutrients or any of that food energy to go towards moving molecules. Stuff just spreads out. Well, osmosis is specific for the movement of water molecules. So again, they're going to move from where they're in greater concentration to where they are in lesser concentration. Water molecules also move from high to low concentrations. So in this picture, these little blue molecules are actually water molecules. And in this picture, if they follow the rules for passive transport, they should move in a net direction from the left to the right. Why? Because they're in a higher concentration on the left-hand side than they are on the right-hand side. And water molecules, just like other molecules, are going to want to spread out. So again, remember that it's simply the diffusion of water. That's the definition of osmosis, diffusion of the water. And water, it's very small. It's just, it's H2O, right? That means that there's two hydrogen molecules that are bound to an oxygen atom. And they're small, but water is so important to living things and how living things function that we pay pretty close attention to how it works, how the movement of water works. And therefore we specifically call it osmosis and pay attention to the direction that it travels. So in order to study how osmosis actually works and which direction molecules are going to move, the first thing we want to do is we want to remember that water is always going to move from where there's more water molecules to where there's less water molecules. Whether that's inside or out of the cell, it's always going to move from where there's more water molecules to where there's less water molecules. So, we have different types of solutions compared to the cell, and the first one is called a hypotonic solution. Hypotonic. Now, if we break that word down, hypo actually means under or low or less than, and tonic means strength. So less than strength for this solution is a type of solution that has a lower concentration of solutes. In other words, there's actually a higher concentration of water molecules. So in this hypotonic solution, we take a look at this cell, and in this cell, for this example, we say that it's 20% salt. Well, if it's 20% salt, then we can kind of think in our brains that it would actually be 80% water. And this solution that's outside of the cell, if it's 10% salt, then we can think in our mind that it's actually 90% water. Well, from what you've learned, which direction is water going to move? It's going to move from where it's more concentrated to where it's less concentrated. It's going to move from 90 to 80%. Therefore, in this example, it's actually going to move into the cell. It doesn't really matter what type of solute or substance dissolved in water we're talking about. The water molecules are going to behave independent of the solute molecules. So in other words, the molecules are going to move, once again, from where there is more of them to where there's less of them. So in this example, the result is that water moves inside of the cell. Now essentially the opposite side of that, or the opposite example of that, is what happens when you put a cell into a hypertonic solution. Now hypertonic, remember that if we break that word down, hyper means more than or above, and tonic refers to strength. So a hypertonic solution has a lot of, or relatively more, solutes that are dissolved inside, and therefore a lower water concentration. So if we look at this example, if we look at this example, here's our cell again, and in that cell is 10% salt. So what are we thinking? 90% water. And the solution is actually 20% salt, so we're thinking 80% water. So where's water going to move? Water molecules will move from where there's more of them to where there's less of them. And this net result is water moving outside of the cell. So in hypertonic solutions, water will leave the cell. Here's some plant cells. And then you actually see that the cells shrink up or they shrivel up. Well, this is an example of a plant cell. That's exactly what happens when plants wilt. Is water leaves them, they become limp, they become wilted, and it's because water has left the cell. This third type of solution is called isotonic solution. So iso meaning same, so for same strength. And this is where the concentration outside of the cell is the same as it or equal to the inside of the cell. And therefore there's not going to be any net movement of molecules or water molecules specifically. Now remember that water molecules will continue to move. There will always be the movement, but there won't be a net change because they are equal already. So molecules will be essentially coming and going into and out of the cell. So here's a great little practice for you to think about, and the answers are already labeled for you here. But think about what the pictures are showing. These both represent cells. On the top, they represent blood cells from humans or animals, and plant cells at the bottom. And by what you see happening, what type of solution must they be put in? Well, if they shrivel up, like in A, if the cell shrinks or shrivels, water must have left the cell. And if it left the cell, it's because it was in a hypertonic solution. Letter C, the opposite extreme over here, is because the water enters the cells, they either plump up and expand even to a point where they burst, or they continue to swell and bulge. It's because water moved into the cell, and it must have moved in because it was put in a hypotonic solution. And the middle one, where you really see a normal condition or there's no change one way or the other, that's because the strength of the solution inside the cell was the same as the strength of the solution outside the cell. And so finally, we're not going to deal in a whole lot of these specifics of what happens with osmosis. But in plants, for instance, in plants we already talked about that plants actually wilt because they lose water. But plants, think about it, plants don't have a skeleton. And the reason that they're able to, that stems and leaves are able to stand up against gravity is because of something called turgor pressure. And essentially, that's just because all of the cells kind of act like little water balloons. And when they're full of water, they're very firm. And kind of the opposite of that, again, is what happens when plants wilt. When they wilt, it's because all the water is let go or let out of a cell, kind of like emptying a water balloon. The balloon just comes limp and flimsy. So it's important to a lot of different living things that osmotic pressure, how much water is inside the cell, is an important characteristic of different types of cells.